The Man Who Moved the Earth. The Story of Galileo Galilei. Prologue, and yet it moves. Imagine being forced to kneel before the Inquisition, surrounded by men in red robes who hold the power of life and death. Imagine being 70 years old, your health failing, your life's work condemned as heresy. Imagine being forced to renounce the truth you've spent decades proving, that the earth moves around the sun, not the other way around. Imagine saying the words they demand, I abjure, curse, and detest my belief that the earth moves. And then, legend says, as you rise from your knees, you mutter under your breath, Eppur esai muove, and yet it moves. This is the story of Galileo Galilei, the man who pointed a telescope at the heavens and shattered humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. A man who proved that Earth was not the center of creation, that the perfect heavens were full of imperfection, that the authority of scripture and tradition could be challenged by observation and mathematics. But this is also the story of a man whose brilliance was matched by his arrogance, whose discoveries were undermined by his inability to compromise, whose triumph turned to tragedy because he couldn't stop himself from picking fights he couldn't win. This is the story of the man who moved the earth, and paid the price for it. Chapter 1. The Rebel Son. On February 15, 1564, in the city of Pisa, Vincenzo Galilei and his wife Giulia welcomed their first child into the world. They named him Galileo, after an ancestor, though the name would become so famous that people would forget there had been an earlier Galileo Galilei. Vincenzo was a musician and music theorist, a man who believed in experimentation and questioning authority. He challenged the musical theories of ancient Greeks, conducting experiments with strings and weights to understand the mathematics of harmony. He taught his son a crucial lesson: don't trust the authorities. Test everything yourself. It was advice Galileo would follow, sometimes to his benefit, sometimes to his doom. Young Galileo was brilliant, witty, and argumentative. He had a gift for mathematics and a talent for making both friends and enemies with equal ease. His sharp tongue and sharper mind made him popular among some and despised by others. Vincenzo wanted his eldest son to become a doctor, a respectable, lucrative profession. In 1581, Galileo enrolled at the University of Pisa to study medicine. He hated it. Medical texts were filled with the teachings of ancient authorities like Galen and Aristotle. Students were expected to memorize and accept, not question and test. For someone like Galileo, with a natural instinct to challenge and verify, it was intellectual torture. But one day, during a particularly boring sermon in the Cathedral of Pisa, Galileo noticed something that would change his life. A chandelier was swinging overhead, set in motion by someone lighting the candles. Galileo watched it swing, timing the oscillations against his own pulse. And he noticed something remarkable. Whether the chandelier swung in a wide arc or a narrow one, each swing took the same amount of time. The period of the pendulum was constant, regardless of the amplitude. This observation, made while bored in church, would eventually lead to the invention of the pendulum clock and establish one of the fundamental principles of physics. Galileo abandoned medicine and threw himself into mathematics and natural philosophy. His father was furious. There was no money in mathematics. But Galileo didn't care about money. He cared about truth. Chapter 2. The Mathematical Rebel. Galileo left the University of Pisa without a degree, too poor to continue and too interested in mathematics to waste time on medicine. He returned home and began giving private mathematics lessons, scraping by while building a reputation as a brilliant young mathematician. In 1589, at age 25, Galileo was appointed to the chair of mathematics at the University of Pisa. It was a position of prestige but little pay. Mathematics was considered less important than philosophy or theology. At Pisa, Galileo began his lifelong war against Aristotelian physics. Aristotle had taught that heavy objects fall faster than light ones. It was common sense: drop a rock and a feather, and the rock hits the ground first. Everyone knew it was true. Galileo said it was nonsense. He argued that in the absence of air resistance, all objects fall at the same rate regardless of weight. He conducted experiments, rolling balls down inclined planes, timing their descent, proving mathematically that Aristotle was wrong. The famous story of Galileo dropping weights from the Leaning Tower of Pisa is probably a legend. But it captures something true about Galileo, his willingness to publicly demonstrate that ancient authorities were wrong, that observation and experiment trumped philosophical reasoning. His colleagues hated him for it. Aristotle had been the authority for over 1,000 years. Who was this arrogant young mathematician to declare him wrong? Galileo made enemies. He mocked the Aristotelians. He wrote satirical poems ridiculing the university's professors who insisted on wearing academic robes. Galileo refused to wear his. He was brilliant, correct, and insufferable. In 1592, his contract at Pisa was not renewed. At age 28, Galileo was unemployed again. But his reputation had spread. The University of Padua, in the Republic of Venice, offered him a position. The pay was better, the intellectual atmosphere freer, the city more cosmopolitan. Galileo moved to Padua, beginning what he would later call the happiest 18 years of his life. Chapter 3: The Padua Years, Love and Discovery. In Padua, Galileo flourished. He was a charismatic lecturer whose classes were so popular that students had to arrive early to get seats. He was witty, engaging, and brilliant at explaining complex ideas through demonstrations and thought experiments. He also met Marina Gamba, a Venetian woman with whom he began a relationship. They never married. Galileo had no money for a dowry and perhaps no desire for the legal complications of marriage, but they lived together and had 3 children, Virginia, Livia, and Vincenzo. Galileo loved his daughters deeply, though he would later place them in a convent, partly because as illegitimate daughters, they had limited marriage prospects, partly because he couldn't afford dowries. During the Padua years, Galileo worked on practical problems. He invented a military compass for calculating artillery trajectories. He studied fortifications. He gave private lessons to wealthy students and foreign nobles who paid well. But he was also conducting secret experiments on motion, developing a mathematical physics that contradicted Aristotle at every turn. He discovered the law of falling bodies. Distance increases as the square of time. He worked out the parabolic trajectory of projectiles. He developed the principle of inertia. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by a force. These were revolutionary insights, but Galileo kept them mostly private. He was cautious, still building his career, not ready to take on the entire Aristotelian establishment. Then, in 1609, news reached Padua that Dutch spectacle makers had invented a device that made distant objects appear closer, a spyglass, they called it. Galileo immediately grasped the potential. Within days, he had built his own version, improving the magnification from 3 times to 9 times. He demonstrated it to Venetian officials, who immediately saw its military value. Ships could be spotted hours before they reached port. Armies could be observed from a distance. The Venetian Senate was so impressed they doubled Galileo's salary and gave him a lifetime appointment. But Galileo had bigger plans for his telescope than watching ships. He pointed it at the sky. Chapter 4: The Starry Messenger. What Galileo saw through his telescope in the winter of 1609 to 1610 shattered the Aristotelian cosmos. First, he looked at the moon. Instead of a perfect crystalline sphere, he saw mountains, valleys, and craters. The moon was rough, imperfect, Earth-like. The celestial realm was not fundamentally different from the terrestrial realm. Second, he looked at the Milky Way. Instead of a glowing cloud, he saw it was composed of countless individual stars, too faint to see with the naked eye. The universe contained far more stars than anyone had imagined. Third, he discovered 4 moons orbiting Jupiter. Here was proof that not everything orbited Earth. Jupiter had its own satellites, its own miniature solar system. Earth was not the center of all motion in the universe. Fourth, he observed that Venus showed phases like the moon. Sometimes it was a crescent, sometimes gibbous, sometimes nearly full. This was impossible in the old Ptolemaic system where everything orbited Earth. But it made perfect sense if Venus orbited the Sun. The implications were staggering. The Earth was not the center of the universe. The heavens were not perfect and unchanging. The cosmos was vastly larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. Galileo published his findings in a short book called Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger. Published in March 1610, it became an instant sensation across Europe. Galileo was 46 years old, and suddenly he was famous. The Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo II de' Medici, offered Galileo a position as chief mathematician and philosopher in Florence, with a huge salary and no teaching duties. Galileo accepted immediately, naming Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars, in honor of his patron. He returned to Florence in triumph, leaving behind his happy years in Padua, his relationship with Marina, and the relative intellectual freedom of Venice. It was a mistake that would eventually cost him everything. Chapter 5. The Gathering Storm. In Florence, Galileo continued his observations and discoveries. He observed Saturn, seeing something strange around it that his telescope couldn't resolve clearly, the rings. He observed sunspots, proving that even the sun was imperfect and changing. Each discovery hammered another nail in the coffin of Aristotelian cosmology. But Galileo wasn't content with just making discoveries. He wanted to win arguments. He wanted to humiliate his opponents. He wanted everyone to acknowledge that he was right and the Aristotelians were wrong. He wrote letters mocking philosophers who refused to look through the telescope. He ridiculed those who couldn't see what he saw or who questioned his interpretations. He was brilliant, arrogant, and making powerful enemies. Some opponents claimed the telescope was unreliable, that it created optical illusions, that you couldn't trust what you saw through it. Others argued that even if Galileo's observations were accurate, they didn't prove the Earth moved. They had a point. Galileo's observations were consistent with a sun-centered system, but they didn't absolutely prove it. There were other possible explanations, other models that could account for what Galileo saw. But Galileo was convinced. The Earth moved around the sun. Copernicus had been right. And Galileo was determined to prove it. In 1613, Galileo wrote a letter discussing how biblical passages that seemed to say the Earth was stationary should be interpreted. Scripture was written in the language of common people, he argued. When Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, it was speaking in everyday language, not making a scientific claim about cosmology. The letter was dangerous. It suggested that Scripture could be wrong about natural phenomena, that theology should defer to science when it came to understanding the physical world. Conservative theologians were outraged. Who was this mathematician to tell the Church how to interpret the Bible? In 1616, the Inquisition declared that the idea that the sun is the center of the universe and that the earth moves was foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical. Copernicus's book was placed on the index of forbidden books. Galileo was privately warned not to hold or defend the Copernican theory. Galileo agreed to the warning. He had no choice. But he seethed with frustration. Chapter 6. The Fatal Book. For several years, Galileo remained relatively quiet. He worked on other projects, avoided direct confrontation with the Church, and waited for a more favorable climate. In 1623, a new pope was elected, Urban VIII, born Maffeo Barberini. Urban was a cultured, intellectually sophisticated man who had been friendly with Galileo. He appreciated science and even wrote poetry in Galileo's honor. Galileo thought he finally had a pope who would support him. He traveled to Rome and had several audiences with Urban VIII. Galileo came away convinced that if he could present the Copernican system properly, the Pope would allow it to be taught as a hypothesis, if not as proven fact. So Galileo began writing a book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a comparison between the Ptolemaic Earth-centered system and the Copernican sun-centered system. It was written as a dialogue between three characters, Salviati, representing Galileo's views, Simplicio, defending Aristotelian views, and Segreto, an intelligent layman asking questions. The structure was brilliant and devastating. Salviati presented the Copernican arguments clearly and persuasively. Simplicio defended the old views with increasingly absurd arguments, becoming a figure of ridicule. Galileo put some of the Pope's own arguments in the mouth of Simplicio. It was a catastrophic mistake. When the dialogue was published in 1632, it was an immediate success. Everyone could see that Galileo had effectively demolished the Ptolemaic system and made a powerful case for Copernican cosmology. Everyone could also see that Galileo had made the Pope look like a fool. Urban VIII was furious. He had been Galileo's friend, his supporter, his patron. And Galileo had repaid him by putting his words in the mouth of a simpleton named Simplicio. The Pope felt betrayed and humiliated. And a humiliated Pope is a dangerous enemy. Chapter 7. The Trial. In September 1632, the Inquisition banned the dialogue and ordered Galileo to appear in Rome for trial. Galileo was 68 years old, in poor health and terrified. He begged to be allowed to submit written testimony or to be tried in Florence. His requests were denied. In February 1633, Galileo made the painful journey to Rome. The trial began in April. The charges were clear. Galileo had violated the 1616 injunction not to hold or defend the Copernican theory. The dialogue clearly defended Copernican theory, regardless of its dialogue format. Galileo tried to defend himself. He argued that the dialogue presented both sides fairly, that he hadn't actually defended Copernican theory but merely examined it. He claimed he had permission to write the book. None of it worked. The outcome was predetermined. On June 22, 1633, Galileo was brought before the Inquisition to hear the sentence. He was found vehemently suspect of heresy. The dialogue was banned. Galileo was ordered to abjure, to formally renounce his belief that the earth moves. Galileo, kneeling, read the abjuration. I, Galileo Galilei, abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies, and I swear that in the future I will never again say or assert, verbally or in writing, anything that might furnish occasion for a similar suspicion. He was sentenced to imprisonment, later commuted to house arrest, for the remainder of his life. The old man rose from his knees, defeated. Or so it seemed. Legend says that as he rose, Galileo muttered under his breath, Eppur si muove, and yet it moves. The story is almost certainly false. Galileo was too smart and too scared to say anything that could make his situation worse. But the phrase captures something essential about Galileo and about truth itself. No matter what authorities declare, no matter what sentences are pronounced, reality remains unchanged. The earth moves around the sun whether the church admits it or not. You cannot alter truth by threatening those who speak it. Chapter 8. The House Arrest Years, Triumph in Defeat. Galileo returned to his villa in Arcetri, outside Florence, under house arrest. He was forbidden to receive visitors without permission, forbidden to discuss Copernican theory, forbidden to publish. For most men, it would have been the end. But Galileo's mind was still sharp, still brilliant, still rebellious. He couldn't publish on cosmology, so he returned to his earlier work on motion and mechanics, work that was less controversial but equally important. He wrote Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to Two New Sciences, a comprehensive summary of his life's work on motion, strength of materials, and mathematical physics. It was arguably more important than the dialogue. While the dialogue defended Copernican cosmology, the two new sciences laid the foundations for modern physics. It developed the mathematics of motion, the principle of inertia, the laws of falling bodies, the parabolic trajectory of projectiles. This was the book that Isaac Newton would build on decades later when developing his own laws of motion. But Galileo couldn't publish in Italy. So the manuscript was smuggled out of the country and published in Leiden, Holland in 1638. The Inquisition couldn't stop it. Truth finds a way. Meanwhile, Galileo's personal life was marked by tragedy. His beloved daughter Virginia, who had become a nun and taken the name Sister Maria Celeste, died in 1634 at age 33. Galileo had been close to her. She managed his household affairs, copied his manuscripts, and supported him emotionally. Her death devastated him. His health continued to decline. He went blind in 1638, losing the sight that had allowed him to see Jupiter's moons and Saturn's rings and the mountains on the moon. But even blind, Galileo continued to work. Students came to study with him, with the Inquisition's grudging permission. He dictated letters and ideas. His mind remained active until the very end. Chapter 9. The Final Days. By late 1641, Galileo was dying. Fever racked his body. His strength was failing. But his mind was still working through problems, still asking questions, still seeking to understand. On January 8, 1642, Galileo Galilei died at his villa in Arcetri. He was 77 years old. The Grand Duke of Tuscany wanted to give Galileo a magnificent tomb in Florence's Santa Croce Basilica, alongside Michelangelo and other Tuscan heroes. The Pope refused permission. Galileo had died under sentence from the Inquisition. He could not be honored with a grand monument. So Galileo was buried quietly in a small chapel. It would be 95 years before his body was moved to a proper tomb in Santa Croce. The Church had won the immediate battle. Galileo had been silenced, his books banned, his reputation tarnished. But Galileo had won the war. Chapter 10. The Revenge of Reality. Within decades of Galileo's death, the evidence for a sun-centered universe became overwhelming. Astronomers across Europe, using better telescopes, confirmed and extended Galileo's discoveries. Newton published his Principia in 1687, providing the mathematical framework that explained why planets orbit the sun, turning Copernican cosmology from hypothesis into demonstrated fact. Slowly, grudgingly, the Church began to soften its position. In 1718, the ban on publishing books teaching Copernican theory was quietly lifted. In 1758, the general prohibition on books advocating heliocentrism was removed from the index of forbidden books. But it wasn't until 1822, nearly 200 years after Galileo's trial, that the Church officially permitted teaching that the Earth moves around the sun. In 1979, Pope John Paul II ordered a re-examination of Galileo's trial. In 1992, the Church officially admitted that the Inquisition had erred in condemning Galileo. It was a formal, if belated, acknowledgement that Galileo had been right all along. It took 359 years for the Church to admit its mistake. But the Earth kept moving the entire time. Epilogue. The Legacy of Defiance. Galileo Galilei didn't discover that the Earth moves around the sun. Copernicus proposed that decades earlier. He didn't invent the telescope. Dutch spectacle makers did that. What Galileo did was transform astronomy from a theoretical, mathematical exercise into an observational science. He proved that the heavens could be studied, measured, and understood through instruments and experiments, not just philosophical reasoning. He showed that mathematical laws govern the physical world, that observation trumps authority, that experiment defeats speculation. He laid the foundations that Newton, Einstein, and all subsequent physicists would build upon. But more than any specific discovery, Galileo represented something profoundly important: the courage to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it contradicts authority, tradition, and power. Galileo could have been cautious. He could have presented his findings more diplomatically. He could have avoided antagonizing the Pope. He could have stayed safe and comfortable. Instead, he wrote what he believed was true, in a way designed to persuade, and he paid the price for it. Was Galileo a martyr for science? Partly. But he was also arrogant, confrontational, and sometimes his own worst enemy. A more diplomatic person might have achieved the same scientific goals with less personal suffering. But diplomacy wasn't Galileo's strength. Truth-telling was. Even when truth-telling was dangerous. Final thoughts. The Earth still moves. Today, we live in a world Galileo helped create. A world where observation and experiment determine truth, where authority can be questioned, where the universe is knowable through mathematics and reason. We point telescopes at distant galaxies and see billions of years into the past. We've landed robots on Mars and sent spacecraft beyond our solar system. We understand the universe from subatomic particles to the cosmic web of galaxies. All of this builds on the foundation Galileo helped establish, that the universe operates by natural laws we can discover and understand. But Galileo's story also warns us about the cost of speaking truth to power, about how institutions resist change even when confronted with overwhelming evidence, about how long it can take for truth to be officially acknowledged. The Church eventually admitted Galileo was right. But it took centuries. How many other truths are we resisting today? How many modern Galileos are we ignoring or silencing? Galileo's greatest legacy isn't his discoveries. Many of those would have been made by others eventually. His greatest legacy is his example, that one person, armed with observations and reason, can challenge the most powerful institutions in the world. He couldn't stop the church from condemning him. He couldn't prevent his books from being banned. He couldn't avoid house arrest and humiliation. But he could tell the truth as he understood it. He could make his observations public. He could write his books and trust that eventually, someday, people would recognize their value. And he was right to have that faith. The books survived. The observations were confirmed. The truth prevailed. Eppur si muove, and yet it moves. Galileo probably never said those words. But they've become his eternal motto because they capture the essence of his life and work. Reality doesn't care about our opinions, our authorities, or our traditions. The earth moves around the sun. It did in Galileo's time. It did before Galileo. It does today. Truth is patient. Truth can wait. Truth will outlast every institution that tries to suppress it. Galileo spent his final years under house arrest, blind and broken, his books banned, his life's work condemned as heresy. But he had already won. Because he had looked through a telescope and seen the truth. And once seen, truth cannot be unseen. The moons of Jupiter still orbit. Venus still shows phases. The sun still has spots. The earth still moves. No proclamation, no sentence, no authority can change these facts. Galileo pointed a telescope at the sky and saw a new universe, vast, complex, governed by mathematical laws, and utterly indifferent to human authority. He showed us that universe. And once we've seen it, we cannot go back to believing we're at the center of creation. That's Galileo's gift to humanity. Not just scientific discoveries, but liberation from the illusion that we're the center of everything. We're not at the center. We're on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable galaxy among billions of galaxies. And that's more wonderful, more awe-inspiring, more magnificent than being at the center of a small, human-sized cosmos could ever be. Galileo freed us from the center. And in doing so, he gave us the universe. Thank you, Galileo. For your courage. For your stubbornness. For your brilliant, arrogant, defiant genius. The earth moves. And so do we, forward, outward, upward, into the cosmos you helped us understand. In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual. Galileo Galilei.